thank you for joining this session this afternoon. I know we've got quite a bit of noise to contend with, so I hope you can hear us. So welcome to Guardians of the Grid, the importance of securing critical infrastructure. So I'm Emily Taylor. I'm the founder of the DNS Research Federation and editor of Chatham House's Journal of Cyber Policy. And I'm joined today by a fantastic panel who are going to explore the parameters of this question of securing national critical infrastructure. So I have David Cormie, who is the Director of Resilience, Security and Risk at Arup. I have Melanie Garson, who's the Cyber Policy Lead at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and Jonathan Ellison, who is the Director for Resilience and Future Technology at the National Cybersecurity Centre. So, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining the panel. So we're talking today about the importance of securing critical infrastructure. And I guess most people would think that they understand what critical infrastructure is, right? It's power grids, it's water, it's hospitals and healthcare systems. But is it actually that easy to pin down what critical infrastructure is? I mean, can I ask you, Jonathan, to start with this and maybe ask each of you to name what the most surprising thing that turned out to be critical infrastructure that you've come across is? Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and it's great to be here and to join you here at CogX. I think the thing for me about the critical infrastructure is that it's easy to name the sectors. You can talk about energy, water, whatever, but I think it's the stuff that sits underneath that, right? It's the fact that it's both physical and it's digital, the fact that it's both public sector and it's private sector, the fact that it's national, the fact that it's international, the fact that there's global supply chains that it depends on, and the complexity that goes into understanding all the different little bits that have an impact on these sectors that absolutely underpin our way of life. And I can't think of a single surprising one off the top of my head right now, but it's the issue that, like, every time you come up with one of these examples, just the chain of things that make up the CNI or that contribute to the CNI is incredible, and that complexity makes the challenge of securing it really quite difficult.
Yeah, so Dr. Melanie Garson, I mean, Jonathan has just talked about, how complex this is the boundaries between the physical and the cyber, which we can come to you on, David, but also the sort of, what the complexity of the supply chain. Can you think of sort of weird examples of things that turn out to be critical after they've been compromised?
Yeah, I mean, it's this question of you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And it happens very quickly, and because we're constantly expanding layers of technology onto everything we're doing, that it will happen in a minute. Recently, when Kenya was hit, they've gone through a massive digital expansion. They found the e-visa system down. Suddenly, nobody can get into the country because they're trying to apply for a visa online. So I think it's those little things that we suddenly think, actually, this is now critical to our tourist industry, for our security, our economic security, and then overall, it becomes a critical national infrastructure problem.
Yeah, and thank you. David Cormie, so your work as an engineer at Arup, I mean, you're very much, your whole career is in the physical world and physical security. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that migration or the interplay between the cyber and the physical as you see, and how critical infrastructure appears to you?
Well, firstly, there is a definition, mainly sector-based, of critical national infrastructure, but we're talking about critical infrastructure. And one of the, there is a perception around this. What is critical to one person is not critical to another. And similarly, Jonathan already mentioned that a lot of infrastructure is held by private organizations. That organization may not recognize the criticality that they have towards others. So, small software suppliers that they may only be half a dozen people, and they supply something which suddenly becomes really critical to the operator of an airport. Or taking another recent example, energy prices caused fertilizer manufacturers to suspend production in the UK in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. One of the byproducts of production of ammonia is carbon dioxide, and some of you will remember that caused impact on food supply chains, because suddenly chicken couldn't be packaged in supermarkets because the CO2 that was available was diverted to hospitals, which is where it was. So suddenly it put the healthcare sector in conflict with the food sector, and all of these surprising interfaces are what make this a really critical, really difficult, complex area to work on. And I think it is, it's for me, it's this point about the perception of criticality. What is critical to one person may not be critical to another, or putting it the other way around, what is not critical to one person may have huge criticality to another.
Yeah, so we've established that it's not always obvious what critical infrastructure is, and that the boundaries between, there's huge supply chains, different sectors. It's difficult to put your finger on. So let's turn to thinking about what the threats are and who are the major threat actors. Who are you worried about? And from a cybersecurity point of view, what could go wrong? So, Melanie, you've been doing a lot about, David's just been talking about the impact of the war on Ukraine on food supply here, but you've been doing a lot of research at the Tony Blair Institute on the war in Ukraine. And, maybe you could just give us a bit about, how that's made you reflect on critical infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think, and any of you that heard Ian Bremer talk this morning, who also touched on this, is one of the very rapidly notable things about securing critical national infrastructure when we came to Ukraine conflict is that it was done by the private sector. And it was done by actors who had the agility, the flexibility, and the means to be able to make sure that whether it was prevent attacks on government and continue to do so, to the electricity grid, to also, didn't quite thought that the attack on Viasat, but were able to compensate for that with alternative measures, so like Starlink coming in, which is now, but of course, that dependency, and this is thinking about where the actors sit within this picture and what's critical for one and what isn't necessarily to the other, is one of the challenges of what we're looking at, because they answer to shareholders. They don't necessarily answer to government. Are they always set up to deal even-handedly with different crises, and do they perceive what is for one country's national infrastructure the same as how they're perceiving it, for whether it's both for good intention with what they perceive to be the critical national infrastructure, or what is actually necessary in that country. So there's a lot of tension with incredible work done with them becoming part of the guardianship of the grid. And there's a lot of advantages, but we have to be able to mitigate some of those effects and how they assume that responsibility.
Yeah. But in one way, I think that a lot of sort of cyber watchers were, projecting this sort of cybergeddon type of idea that critical infrastructure in the Ukraine conflict would be attacked through cyber. But in fact, the real world conflict doesn't seem to have played out. It turns out it's easier to just blow something up than it is to have the patience to compromise it in that way. But as you say, with the Starlink, you also have the importance of the internet itself as critical infrastructure. But Jonathan, with the National Cybersecurity Centre recently published, along with the other Five Eyes, an advisory on China as a threat actor in critical infrastructure. I mean, all states spy, right? So why should we be surprised that potentially hostile states would be all over our critical infrastructure? And why should it worry us?
Yeah, absolutely. So we issued an advisory a few months ago alongside our American colleagues about Chinese state-sponsored activity within the United States critical national infrastructure. And I think that should be seen as a bit of a wake-up moment from a perspective of what China was doing. And I think just because you find a nation state targeting a critical national infrastructure doesn't mean that they're going to tomorrow switch off the lights or tomorrow switch off the water. But I think when you think about the whole range of threat actors that are going against different bits of our economy, including the critical infrastructure, it's a really good motivator to start to think about, so therefore, what do we need to do to make our infrastructure more resilient so that in an uncertain world, in geopolitical strife in years to come, that we can be more confident in the resilience of the things that underpin our way of life when those things happen. And because it takes such a long time to build that resilience, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later, now is the time to start to build your resilience in light of the kinds of threats we see from China or the kind of threat that you see demonstrated by Russia, as we've just talked about. And so now is the time to get at that problem and start making the UK more resilient.
And would you say, sort of stepping back from a high level, would you say that we are where we need to be at the moment in terms of, or any country is where they need to be in terms of resilience?
So are we where we need to be? I think the easy answer is no. I think I think we are comparatively really good globally. We are really good we have good advice and guidance, we have good regulatory frameworks, we have an industry that works with government to make the UK more resilient and more secure. But just because we have the intent, just because we have the relationships and we're starting to build that resilience, are we at a point where we are resilient enough? Absolutely not, and there is a long way to go. But it's really hard, it's really complex, and so therefore that's why we need to work together. It's why the private sector, the public sector, government with industry need to get on it and make the UK more resilient for future threats, for the security of the nation.
And David, from your perspective, coming from Arup in the private sector, do you think that the sort of merger between the cyber world and the physical world is presenting challenges, and how can we learn from the much more mature industries like engineering and the physical security? Do you think do we over fetishize how different cyber is, or do you think there could be lessons that go the other way?
I don't think we do over fetishize it. I think one of the particular difficulties that we have around built assets is that building resilience is system by system and even device by device. Taking operational technology, very often, we go into buildings and looking at the design of assets where the firmware on devices is not upgradable. So it is really right down to that level of detail. And one of the things which, one of the differences that I see between the more mature, approaches to what I might characterize as old-fashioned physical threats, and the new threat around cyber, is that in the protection against cyber threats, it's actually recognized that there is a vulnerability, we do something about it. Okay? Not one person in this room would, or listening today would necessarily kind of begin to start to argue, well, look, that threat's there, but it's unlikely to be exploited. Nobody really tries to take a stab, other than colleagues who genuinely do have the inside knowledge about what the likelihood of exploitation is. There's a vulnerability there. We work to address it. In the protection against physical threats, and they are different things because the cost of protection does differ. There is often optimism bias leads us to arguing away threats on likelihood grounds. So we actually leave in the vulnerabilities because we convince ourselves that they're never going to be exploited. The world changes the next day and suddenly then we have a problem. So I think both fields can learn from each other.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about how you secure stuff, we're here today at CogX. We're all thinking and talking about artificial intelligence. Maybe we can just do a little bit of a detour around, what artificial intelligence will mean both for defenders of critical infrastructure and also for the threat actors. Melanie, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, my mantra with anything tech, including artificial intelligence, is that with great capability comes great vulnerability. So you have this, an incredibly sophisticated set of tools now that can be built in across all sorts of arenas that can provide for incredible good. And, it creates, but at the same time, this rapidly expanding surface of not only what now needs to be increasingly protected because of knowing where that is in the supply chain, but also the sort of what becomes the wicked problem of that these tools can also make the malicious attacks easier at the same time whilst it creates the solution. So we're both creating the problems and the solution and pitching them up against each other at an expanding surface, if you want horizontally, but also vertically. So it goes down from subsea cables all the way up to the satellites. So it's exciting, but it will certainly keep us on our toes.
Yeah, luckily we got everything else sorted out before AI came along, right? And Jonathan, thinking about both defence or attack vectors, how do you think AI changes things, if at all?
I think that there are three things for me when it comes to the AI cybersecurity kind of overlap. I think one is, what does AI do to the threats that we face? So how much easier is it to create a convincing phishing email? How much easier is it to do it at scale, much faster, at the volume of the kind of threats that we already face, but it can be at a much higher volume, much more convincing, and so therefore, how do we deal with that? And then I think the other two bits for me are AI for security. So how can we use AI to get a defender advantage? So where can AI be used to improve the way we do cyber defense across the country, whether or not that's commercially in the kind of products on offer or the kinds of things the government does to defend the UK? And then the third strand for me is security of AI. So AI can only be ethical, predictable, explainable if it is secure. If you don't understand the security of the model in the first place, or the companies that are building the models, if you can't be confident in their security, then you can't rely on any of the other things either about the ethics or the morality or the transparency or the predictability. So therefore, how do we bake in security at the start? And I think for me, that is about designing software that is secure, fundamentally, right? And so secure by design is a set of principles that we and other like-minded organizations have espoused for a while. We spend too long in the cybersecurity world trying to rectify and deal with things that should have been designed out at the early stages of a product, right? Before it goes to market, before it ends up with consumers. And so we spend time patching, we spend time updating, right? And that's where software, most of the time, that is where software hasn't been designed with a lot of the safety or security features it should have been in the first place, or tested properly or whatever. So how do we get the principles around secure design and secure deployment of these kinds of tools baked in right at the start so that we get an advantage from the beginning rather than having to retrofit security 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
Yeah, thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left of the panel. I mean, David, please do come in on AI on this, but actually I'd like to sort of think about, we've established that this is an almost endless potential attack surface or defining critical infrastructure is difficult. There are a range of threat actors in it for all sorts of reasons, whether it's espionage, disruption, ransomware, making money, whatever. The technology is moving incredibly fast. Can we just have a go at, what good would look like? If we feel like we would be winning in our prospective fields if critical infrastructure protection looked like this, or this change had happened. David, do come in on AI as well if you would like to.
I think, picking up that point from Jonathan about secure by design, one of the tensions that we see not only in software design, but in the design of devices in buildings like this one, is the cost of development versus the time to market. Now, in consumer devices, there is a desire to ensure that the software is bug free and is easy to use. The UX is attractive and well designed. In OT devices, that same appetite isn't there because generally it's not, it's never used by consumers. It's used by so-called specialists who have in theory have a better tolerance. So the investment in the design of that software is much lower than in a consumer device.
Right.
So I think there is an issue with that in terms of how we bring designs to market, and the role that different agencies have in that. Bearing in mind that something like 90% of our critical national infrastructure is held in private hands. Government has, through its various agencies, has an advisory role. Those private entities, they have their own primary corporate purpose in terms of their own organisation, return to shareholders, etc. But we create a difficulty because government can only advise. There are some mechanisms that can be used to intervene more strongly, but they're generally used very rarely. We set that against the fact that there is no appetite for investment. I think there are every building of any scale now, there is a digital model that exists of that, digital twin, if you like. There is information that is held in planning portals and in the client's entity, and I think there are we know what vulnerabilities look like, whether that's in software, whether it's in the physical design of the building. So training on a data set that then allows an AI tool to then go looking for vulnerabilities. I think there is a glass half full version of this in terms of the opportunity to find and fix some of the problems that we didn't design out at the beginning. The glass half empty version is the bit that I outlined in terms of the lack of appetite to do so, and the fragmentation of the supply chains and everything that comes together to form a built asset. But I think there is that upside as well.
Yeah. So Melanie, if we're doing the glass half full bit, what to you would be, what would good look like? How will we know when we're getting there?
Yeah, to me, good would look like, and I think one of the things we've not quite talked about here is the massive cyber poverty gap that exists globally. So good for me looks like that when we're working with transformative tech in other countries, that we work to make sure that we close, digital maturity with security maturity at the same time. So we're thinking about how we advise other countries. I think that's one level. Another level good for me also looks like having a very big picture view of what is critical infrastructure in that expanding context, and that means thinking about coming to 2024, how are we securing democracy? How are we securing the actual tools of, are democratic institutions part of security? So really thinking about that big picture before it's really too late, and sort of thinking policy forward for that. And thirdly, not forgetting at the heart of the internet as our most critical national infrastructure in itself, where the risks are also geopolitical, where the risks are being played out in little back corners of the ITU, and that we mustn't forget that as really the foundational critical infrastructure for all the AI and everything else that we want to do.
Yeah, thank you. So we've talked about, you talked earlier about secure by design, we've heard from David that it's easier said than done, that the incentives are not always there. And Melanie's given us an example of both cyber poverty and the need for cyber capacity building in the global south, but also about the criticality of the internet as an infrastructure as well. You know, from sitting in the National Cybersecurity Centre in charge of resilience and risk, how will you know when it's a good day and when you think, right, my job here is done, I can hang up my boots?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question. I think, there are a few things for me about when we know we're winning, right? And I think one is a recognition that this isn't a hypothetical threat, right? This is a real thing, it is happening. Our digital defenses in this country are, being hit every single day. And so a recognition that that there are actors out there who are trying to penetrate different bits of our economy, and that recognition and understanding that this isn't a hypothetical thing that might one day maybe happen to you, but actually this is a real threat to companies, individuals, organizations across the country that we need to do something about. And I think we're gaining ground on that. I think people are starting to understand that this is real, and that it can affect everything from the critical infrastructure through to individuals, so from fraud to ransomware to nation states. I think, though, that for me, one of the big things that really needs to change is around recognition that this isn't just a technology issue. So this isn't just something for tech departments or CISOs in organizations to get at. This is something that the very top of companies and organizations, these are things that boards need to be on top of. And I think what does good look like? Good looks like when boards are as cyber literate as they are financially literate, so that they can ask the right questions, they can sponsor their CISOs, they can provide the right funding, they can have the right conversations. And because resilience isn't just about better defenses, resilience isn't just about building bigger walls, because stuff will get through, right? There's so much of it out there. At some point, your defenses will be broken down. At some point, you will be the victim to something. And so therefore it's about preparation, and it's about understanding what you're going to do, what your contingency plans are, and that kind of planning, that kind of forward thinking needs a board to engage. And then the final point I want to make, is about having the right skilled workforce as well in those organizations, right? And so that's about across our entire economy, making sure we have enough people who have the skills necessary to make us more secure. And to do that, you also need to increase the diversity of the supply chain coming through of people as well. And that is way not good enough and way far away. And that's a whole different panel discussion around diversity of the cybersecurity industry. But until we crack things like that and the throughput of people coming through to the industry, we're not going to have enough people with the right skills and the right positions to actually make this difference across the whole of the economy.
Yeah, thank you. So just as a final thought, you're allowed one sentence each. It's, how do we drive the change that's needed? What have you seen really working in your respective fields in driving the change that is needed? Who'd like to go first on that? Shall I start with... You're laughing most, so I'm going to go for you, Melanie.
You're going to get picked on. I think conceptually it has to be secure by design. I think but think that writ large in everything that we do, because I don't think it's fair to ask little old ladies sitting at home to fight the might of the Russian GRU because her cyber hygiene isn't up to date. That's an unfair expectation.
Thank you. David?
I think I'd pick up on what Jonathan said, that recognizing that this is real, it will happen. We have to get over this. And I think you're right, Jonathan. We are getting there. Get over this idea that this is Hollywood stuff that is just fantastical and phantasmagorical. And I think that level of recognition and realization, for me, that will be a massive step forward.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I probably would have said secure by design, secure by default, but given that's already been said, I think it's about recognition that this is a team thing, right? It's a partnership thing, and individuals can't do it alone, as you just said. Companies can't just do it alone, government can't do it alone, and I think it's only by working across society, by sharing information, by sharing with each other what works, what doesn't work, and working in partnership, that we will ever make real tractable progress on making the UK more resilient.
Great. Well, thank you. That brings our panel to a close. We've heard about how difficult it is to actually put your finger on what critical infrastructure is, and you often only know after there's been an event that a bad file could take out all of air traffic control, for example. We've also heard how important it is that we do face up to the threat. It does get real when it's critical infrastructure. So I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Jonathan Ellison, Dr. Melanie Garson, and David Cormie, for their insights and sharing their knowledge today. Thank you very much.